When darkness descended upon the inner world, it was akin to twilight, dim yet not completely dark. The following day marked the declaration of the twilight reckoning across the inner world. However, a ritual had to be performed for Chanty to strengthen her grip on the Sword of Destiny. This ritual was cloaked in secrecy and forbidden from being disclosed to its intended recipient. Everything was prepared around a large circular table. Surrounding it were 13 entities, each draped in red robes with hoods, revealing only their eyes. They held goblets in their hands. The heavy door to the room opened, and Chanty entered. She wore a sheer red dress without any undergarments. Shock overtook her as she realized she had been deceived. Chanty had believed Mara was taking her to the Golden Bath to fortify her strength for the impending battle against Alexander Mondragon. Mara had handed her the translucent red dress, claiming it was necessary for the ritual, and Chanty had trusted her. As she stepped into the chamber and saw the robed figures around the table, fear gripped her heart. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, locking her inside. Panicked, she grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Her body trembled as terror coursed through her veins, yet she forced herself to remain brave. "Mara, why? You betrayed me," she whispered to herself, leaning against the door as her wide eyes darted between the table and the entities watching her. Suddenly, the Sword of Destiny materialized in her hands. Its radiant glow illuminated the room, and Chanty no longer cared that the sheer dress exposed her completely. She focused solely on defending herself. "Where am I?" Chanty screamed, her voice echoing through the room. "Where am I?" she demanded again. A voice, mechanical and devoid of emotion, replied, "Come to the table, Miss Don Lorenzo." "I won't go there," Chanty shouted, pointing her glowing sword at them. "Anyone who dares come near me will die." Her voice was fierce despite her shaking body. "Open this door." "Let me out," she demanded. "And don't you dare approach me if you value your lives." None of the entities spoke. Then, 3 figures in black robes moved. One carried a bottle of wine, and the other 2 held trays with golden wine glasses. They approached the table, standing in the center of the red-robed figures. "You cannot leave until you drink this wine," one of the black-robed entities said, its voice cold and impassive. It poured wine into the golden glasses, while another held the tray steady. Chanty's panic deepened. "I won't drink that wine. I'm not foolish enough to drink something from strangers," she yelled. "You drink it yourself. I'm not stupid enough to follow your orders. Let me out, now." She swung her sword at the doorknob, and its light sparked upon impact. She continued striking the door, screaming at the top of her lungs. But the door, crafted from a crystal as strong as diamond, remained unyielding. Exhausted and defeated, Chanty slumped to the floor, her breaths ragged. Tears streamed down her face, a mix of anger and fear overwhelming her. "Vasper! Help me!" Chanty screamed, her voice cracking. She called his name repeatedly, sobbing between cries. Minutes passed. Chanty sat near the door, clutching her sword tightly, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. The robed figures remained motionless, as though awaiting her reaction. "Miss Don Lorenzo," the cold voice spoke again, "if you're tired, take the wine from the tray. Give 1 glass to someone in this room to accompany you back to your dome." Chanty hesitated but eventually stood. She stared at the entities, her resolve hardening. "I'll do it, but if any of you make one wrong move, your life will be the price," she warned, her voice trembling but firm. "No one moves if you want to live." She approached the table cautiously, her sword ready. As she neared, she noticed the eyes of the robed entities watching her intently. Something about the figure holding the tray struck her as familiar. "You," she said, pointing with her sword. "Come closer." The figure obeyed, walking towards her. Its movements stirred a growing sense of recognition within Chanty. Her heart pounded as their eyes locked. "Stop right there," she commanded when it was only a few steps away. "Take off your hood. I want to see who you are." The figure bowed slightly. "Your request cannot be granted. You must choose one of us to drink the wine with you," it replied. Silence filled the room. Chanty's gaze darted between the entities. Despite the thick robes obscuring their features, only their eyes visible, Chanty felt a peculiar familiarity with the one holding the tray. She could not shake the feeling that she knew this being. Chanty saw how the being before her let its gaze travel across her body. With steady resolve, she stretched out her sword, pressing the blade's edge right to the creature's neck. The sword's tip barely touched its throat, and as Chanty took one bold step closer, the being tilted its head upward, feeling the blade's sharp proximity. Chanty raised its chin with the blade, her fiery eyes locking onto its piercing blue gaze. She cast a glance at the other hooded figures gathered around the table, their silent, watchful presence unnerving her. Every muscle in her body tensed, her senses razor-sharp as her hand lowered the sword. Suddenly, she moved closer to the figure, grabbing one of the wine glasses from the tray it held. Her other hand kept the sword tightly gripped, ready to strike if needed. As she approached the table, she scrutinized each hooded figure, their faces concealed except for their eyes, searching for the one who deserved the cursed drink. "Whose idea is this? This is madness!" Chanty yelled, her body trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "I'm done with this world. I'm done with all of you." Her voice echoed throughout the room, filled with defiance, but none of the figures responded. Their silence only fueled her frustration. One by one, she tilted their chins up with her sword, examining their eyes. When she reached the eighth figure, something shifted within her. Their brown eyes were strikingly familiar, triggering a pang of longing and sadness. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Jake," she murmured, barely audible. "Is that you?" But the figure remained silent, unmoving like a statue. Chanty's hand trembled as she hesitated to give them the glass, her thoughts a swirling storm of emotions. Another hooded figure, carrying the tray, moved closer, its gaze locked on her. Reluctantly, she turned her attention back, staring deeply into the eyes of the familiar figure. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "You," she said with determination. "Drink the wine. You're my choice." The figure before her reached for the glass, lifting it carefully. Slowly, it pushed back the cloth covering its mouth, revealing only the lower half of its face, and drank a small sip. Then, it extended the glass toward Chanty. She placed her sword on the table for a brief moment to swap her glass with theirs, handing the untouched wine back to the being. In one swift movement, she sipped the wine. While Chanty was sipping her wine, 12 hooded beings exited through the door, their steps swift and purposeful, leaving behind the one she had offered wine to. Chanty cast a sly, fleeting glance at the door through which the beings had vanished, her mind already scheming. She intended to follow them out and leave her companion behind without hesitation. And she threw the remaining liquid and her glass onto the floor. The shattering sound of the glass echoed throughout the room, startling her companion. Chanty seized the moment, sprinting toward the door the other beings had exited through, desperate for escape. But the door slammed shut before she could reach it. Her fingers yanked at the knob, but it refused to budge. She screamed in frustration, her voice raw. "You said I'd get out if I drank the wine," she yelled, slamming her fists against the door. "Vasper. Please. I'm here. Help me." Her cries were desperate as the heat in her body surged, the same unbearable sensation she'd felt after consuming the flower of passion. Her breath quickened in panic as she turned to see the hooded figure kneeling on the floor, gripping its chest. The similarity between their experiences was undeniable. They had drunk the same wine. Chanty's hands trembled as she clutched her sword, backing away toward the table for protection. The figure on the floor removed its hood, revealing none other than Vasper Mondragon. His face was pale, his expression strained with pain as he glanced up at her. Chanty froze in shock, her heart skipping a beat. "Vasper. It's you." Her voice cracked with emotion. "I knew it. I chose right. It was you all along." Vasper, groaning from the intense heat coursing through him, raised a hand to stop her from approaching. "Don't come closer," he warned, his voice firm but filled with agony. "We must endure this without giving in to it, or we risk losing everything. The sword of destiny must remain yours. No mistakes, Chanty." Tears streamed down her face as she stood helplessly, gripping her sword for dear life. Vasper, she whispered through her sobs, I'm scared. But even through his torment, Vasper managed a small, reassuring nod, his resolve unwavering. You chose right, he whispered, his voice a mix of pain and pride, but we must be strong. No matter what. And so, amidst the swirling chaos of emotions, desire, and destiny, Chanty held her ground, her sword burning with light, her will unbroken. Vasper removed his robe, he was completely naked. Chanty was in shock, staring. Vasper's eyes were filled with desire and temptation. Chanty, like a magnet, found herself drawn to Vasper, who appeared as a temptation in her view. They could no longer hold themselves back. Chanty ran toward Vasper, and as their bodies met, it was as if they were starving lions devouring each other's lips. Their hands explored each other's sensitive skin, filling the room with moans of pleasure and joy. They rolled on the floor, embracing tightly. We can't let the wine take over, we can't fail tonight, you have a battle tomorrow, Vasper said, his voice trembling as he restrained himself. He lifted Chanty and positioned her atop him, but they were reversed. They seemed ravenous for each other. Chanty's see-through dress was flung away by Vasper, and his thick robe became their makeshift bedspread on the floor. Their moans and groans filled the room, driven by the effects of the magical wine and their love, heating the atmosphere with their fiery passion. However, Vasper was careful not to break Chanty's virginity. Both were left panting after the wine's first wave, yet their lips never parted. Vasper's declarations of love whispered into Chanty's ears were unending. When the second wave of the wine's effects began, they grew wild once more, though Vasper held himself back, trembling from the effort to control his overwhelming desire. His body shook as he restrained himself, determined not to fail. But Chanty, in that moment, was ready to give him everything, uncaring of what might happen tomorrow. The fire consuming her body was greater than the passion she had tasted before. Still, she noticed Vasper's unyielding determination to ensure she remained unscathed. His lips, hands, and kisses brought her pleasure without crossing the line, waiting for the wine's effects to subside. In the second wave of the wine's effects, they reached the peak of pleasure, both left panting and drenched in sweat, though their lips remained locked. I'm so happy you chose me tonight, Vasper murmured. I'm ready to fight them all if you had chosen someone else. His words echoed softly in Chanty's ear as she gazed into his eyes. When I look into your eyes, my heart tells me it's you, but I'm not certain. I just followed my instincts, but I didn't expect this to happen, Chanty replied, only to moan again as the third wave of the wine's effects struck, and Vasper felt the same. Determined to ride through the wine's effects, Vasper lifted Chanty and laid her on the round table. Their passion burned on the table until they reached their ultimate peak of ecstasy. Exhausted, Vasper collapsed on top of Chanty's equally drained body. Vasper was weary from restraining himself, resisting his intense desire to completely claim Chanty while battling the wine's overpowering effects, which left him utterly drained. Yet they smiled at each other. If I had chosen another man, I'd probably be a criminal by now, Chanty said. Vasper laughed softly. They embraced, both naked, lying on the table. Their eyes spoke of the depths of their hearts and thoughts. Who are they? Why am I here? Why are you holding the tray and the wine? Chanty asked. Vasper smiled, gazing at her. This is your final ritual before the twilight reckoning. Not everyone who enters here passes. All of them failed. Out of the 8 before you, you're the 9th, and you've succeeded. You'll leave here still a virgin, Vasper explained, gently stroking her cheek. Chanty was stunned. Does that mean even my mother went through this? Vasper nodded slowly. But what I heard is, she killed the man she chose, Vasper said, and Chanty was shocked at what she heard. When we leave here, you must reveal your sword of destiny. Someone is waiting for us outside, but I don't know who or what awaits us. I was not invited to this kind of ritual. And I didn't know the people I was with earlier, none of us knew each other. The entry was strict, and different individuals led us in. The instructions given to me came directly from the king himself. When you shouted my name earlier, I was so happy. Do you know that? It was me in your mind and heart during your moment of distress, not Jake. Vasper said, that joy is evident in his voice. But above all, when you chose me, I felt fulfilled. Vasper kissed her lips again, this time lingering. Vasper, they saw my naked body. I was so ashamed, I could have melted in embarrassment, Chanty said through tears, her voice trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. She stood, as did Vasper, but he embraced her tightly as they descended from the table. Don't worry. You don't know them, and they will not speak to anyone else. Death is the price for anyone who reveals what happened in the ritual, Vasper reassured her, stroking her cheek gently. As they broke their embrace, Vasper retrieved his robe. Chanty noticed the red marks and scratches on his back, her nails' imprints vividly visible. She lowered her head in shame, looking at Vasper's back. He noticed her reaction, and his gaze asked an unspoken question. You're back. Chanty murmured softly. Vasper smiled, approaching her again, his eyes filled with affection as they bore into hers. She felt as though she might dissolve under his gaze. She lowered her head, but Vasper lifted her chin, kissing her lips passionately once more. I love you so much, my queen, Vasper whispered against her lips in his deep voice. Chanty couldn't respond as he kissed her again, fervently. When their lips parted, Vasper tore the edge of his robe, large as a towel, and draped it over Chanty's body. But before fully covering her, he let his gaze linger over her entire figure with a mischievous smile. Chanty, now accustomed to Vasper's playful nature, simply watched him. He then dressed her in a sheer red gown before redonning his robe, now shortened just above his knees. Why did your voice earlier sound robotic? Chanty asked. Vasper revealed a small device attached to the mask near the mouth of his robe, showing it to her. The stakes in the kingdom of King Elander's treasury have risen because of your victory tonight. My father will surely prepare for your arrival tomorrow. Do not hesitate to attack him, all his powers will have no effect on you, save for his strength and speed. Remember your training and just focus, Vasper encouraged her. Vasper, he's your father. Why do you speak about him like that? Chanty asked softly, her eyes full of compassion. Vasper smiled. It's his wish, my queen. He seeks death because he's grown weary of life. But no one can defeat him except your sword. He created this event so that, during every twilight reckoning, he could accept challengers who might defeat him in battle. But he won't go down without a fight. I'll be waiting for you outside the arena during that time, Vasper said. Chanty felt her fear intensify. I believe the shadow of the Sword of Destiny will face him when you meet. The sword thirsts for his blood, Vasper continued. Chanty grew even more anxious. Vasper, I saw Jake earlier. He was one of the men standing at the front of the table, Chanty said quietly. Vasper fell silent. You recognized him? Vasper asked, a hint of bitterness in his voice at the mention of Jake's name. Yes, just like you. If I'm not mistaken, it was Jake I saw earlier, Chanty confirmed. Vasper took her hands in his. I'm so lucky you chose me, he said. Chanty remained quiet. I don't know how to face him, she admitted softly. Vasper embraced Chanty tightly. Meanwhile, tears fell from Chanty's eyes, pitying Jake. She saw Jake's eyes were filled with pain, as if his heart was being hunted. Vasper noticed Chanty's serious and conflicted mood, realizing she still harbored concern for Jake and was contemplating their situation. Looking deeply into her eyes, Vasper said, I love you so much. Please don't take away my happiness. His voice pleaded, his gaze begging her. Chanty was stunned, staring at him, unable to move. They held each other's gaze for a long moment before Vasper embraced her tightly once more. As they parted, Vasper held Chanty's hand and led her to the door. Grasping the doorknob, Vasper pulled Chanty close, his arm firmly around her waist, while Chanty held onto his hand around her. When Vasper twisted the knob and opened the door, they were met by rows of guardians standing outside, including Jake. Chanty's eyes immediately met Jake's. His gaze was filled with unspoken words meant for her, and his face showed the toll of sleepless nights and misery. Shanty's attention was drawn to the bow and arrow on Jake's back, her curiosity piqued. She felt Vasper tighten his grip on her waist as David approached them. The 7 guardians stood tall and commanding, their focus on Chanty and Vasper. Jake, however, kept his gaze solely on Chanty. Seeing Jake's pain caused Shanty's heart to ache. She hadn't expected their fates to intertwine in such a cruel way. The pain of their situation was palpable. "Vasper, we'll escort Chanty to her dome," David said firmly, his tone commanding as he looked directly at Vasper. But Vasper turned his gaze to Jake before responding. "No. I'll take her, David," Vasper said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. He glanced at Jake once more, their stares locking in silent challenge. The tension was thick, but they maintained their professionalism. Vasper turned and swiftly led Chanty away, their steps quick as they headed toward their vehicle. David and the others were left behind, watching as Vasper carried Chanty out of the hallway. Jake exhaled deeply, his expression smoldering with rage as he clenched his fists. David placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder twice, but Jake remained motionless, his mind consumed by thoughts of Chanty. The 6 guardians silently followed David, their powerful presence demanding respect from everyone they passed. They were second in rank only to the king in the inner world, with responsibilities spanning both inner and outer realms. Jake had been reinstated as a guardian, along with his wealth and properties. But the king's command forbidding him from approaching or speaking to Chanty until their plans against Vasper Mondragon were complete left him in agony. The law weighed heavily on Jake, especially seeing that Chanty had chosen Vasper in the room earlier. That moment had been his only chance to speak with her, but he hadn't expected her to choose Vasper. The thought of what had transpired between them in the room tortured him. Chanty and Vasper's disheveled appearance spoke volumes of their exhaustion. If any other man had been chosen by Chanty, Chanty would have killed him with her sword if necessary. Jake returned to his quarters, slamming the door shut and throwing his bow against the wall. He let out a guttural scream, his rage and sorrow pouring out. He punched his bed repeatedly, his body trembling as he imagined Chanty in Vasper's arms. The pain he felt was unlike anything he had ever known. Finally, he collapsed onto the remnants of his destroyed bed, pacing his room as his thoughts returned to Chanty. The unfairness of their situation consumed him. He stared at their wedding photos, one of which Chanty had brought with her in her luggage. Was she looking at their photos too? He wondered as tears streamed down his face. "My love, I miss you so much," he murmured painfully through gritted teeth. Meanwhile, Chanty and Vasper showered together, sharing the intense heat of their passion. Chanty's moans echoed throughout the bathroom. The fiery love and desire in Vasper's body remained unquenched despite the waves of exhaustion brought on by the effects of the magic wine. Minutes passed, and almost an hour, and Chanty lay exhausted on the bed, her body overwhelmed by Vasper's unrelenting hunger for her, even after their shared bath. Though they had dressed, a different kind of heat radiated from their bodies. Chanty lay back down and fell asleep again. Meanwhile, Vasper sat beside her, his face serious. He wrapped Chanty in his arms, kissed her neck, cheek, and lips. Chanty groaned softly, a clear sign of her fatigue. Vasper held her tightly, pulling her closer into his embrace. Closing his eyes, he joined her in sleep. Then, Chanty's device suddenly rang, followed by Mara's voice. "Miss Chanty, Princess Salora wishes to see and speak with you." Vasper's expression immediately turned serious. "Mara, where is she now?" he asked. Mara didn't respond right away. "Mara, this is Vasper. Where is Salora? What does she want with Chanty?" Vasper's voice was firm and demanding. Mara hesitated before answering. "Your Majesty, we are just outside Miss Chanty's room." "I'm sorry, but Princess Salora has permission from King Elander." Alert, Vasper turned his gaze toward the door. At the same time, Chanty's eyes fluttered open, and their gazes locked. Chanty sat up abruptly but was pulled back by Vasper, who wrapped his arms around her again. "Mara, what exactly does Salora want with Chanty? What is her purpose?" Vasper asked again, his tone unyielding. Mara took a moment before responding, her voice trembling slightly. Chanty gave Vasper a serious look, silently telling him to let her handle it. Vasper, with his deep voice, said, "Let me take care of this." A voice came through the device, but it was no longer Mara, it was Zalora. "Vasper, come out. I want to speak with you," Zalora's commanding voice said. Vasper clenched his teeth, his eyes fixed on the door. Neither of them spoke as Chanty slowly got up, carefully removing Vasper's arms from around her. She quickly walked to her closet and dressed in a proper gown without saying a word. Vasper also changed, his expression remaining stern. Once dressed, he approached Chanty, taking her hands in his. "Don't let Zalora get to you, okay? She's like Samara, stubborn," Vasper said. Chanty didn't respond, her expression equally unyielding. She realized this was one of the challenges she needed to face by standing beside Vasper, confronting the women from his past who were unwilling to let him go. This thought lingered in her mind as she walked toward the door, Vasper beside her, holding her hand tightly. Vasper was the first to step out, his presence powerful and commanding, his expression ready to protect Chanty from any confrontation. Outside, they were greeted by Chanty's 6 envoy bodyguards stationed near the door. Standing among them were Mara, Princess Zalora, and Lauren. Of the 3 women, only Mara's face was friendly, while the other 2 glared at Chanty with icy stares. Their eyes drifted to Chanty's hand, still clasped tightly in Vasper's. Lauren sneered. "Just yesterday, you were my cousin's wife, and now you're holding hands with another man?" she mocked. Vasper's eyes shifted to Lauren. "Watch your mouth, Lauren, when you speak to my queen. She will be my wife, and I will be her husband, not your cousin." He added with a cutting tone, "From the beginning, Chanty's marriage to your cousin wasn't even legal, and you know that." Lauren and Zalora bristled at Vasper's words. Chanty glanced at Vasper, concern in her eyes, knowing how deeply Zalora's family despised him. Vasper, in turn, tightened his grip around Chanty's waist protectively. Mara moved aside, clearly intimidated by the tension in the air. "Hurry and state your purpose, Zalora, so you can return to your kingdom," Vasper said sternly. Zalora's body trembled with rage, the pain and jealousy she felt toward Chanty evident. Yet, as a princess, she maintained an air of composure, though her emotions betrayed her expression. She wasn't invincible, she had no power to remain unaffected by the events in her life. Zalora turned her sharp gaze to Chanty, standing tall with defiance. "Don Lorenzo, the 300 dragons I paid to Sylvan Concord to invite you have gone to waste because of what you and Vasper have done. Therefore, I've made an agreement with the king that you will repay my 300 dragons through a duel. I want to fight you after the Twilight Reckoning, if you're still alive by then." Her words were laced with provocation, her tone deadly serious. Chanty gaped at Zalora, then glanced at Vasper, who was visibly displeased. "I'll pay her," Vasper said firmly. Zalora raised a finger to silence him. "I will not accept any form of payment except for a fight with Chanty after the Twilight Reckoning. I want her to pay in blood for the humiliation she has caused me." Zalora spoke with a calm yet challenging smile. Chanty looked directly at Zalora, her expression resolute. "No problem, Zalora. If that's your only request, I accept. Just tell me when and where, I won't back down," Chanty replied, her voice full of courage and determination. She had no intention of letting Vasper's past lovers defeat her. Lauren smirked sarcastically, while Zalora turned to Vasper. "And you, Vasper, we are far from finished," she said. "Don't compare me to the women from your past whom you've easily discarded when you grew tired of them." Zalora spat at Vasper, her voice trembling with anger. Chanty felt the awkwardness of the moment, while Vasper's expression remained stern, his gaze fixed on Zalora. Chanty lowered her eyes, feeling the sharpness of Zalora's glare. Meanwhile, Mara kept her head down, her hands trembling. "You know from the very beginning, you were the only man in my life." "No one else," Zalora began, her voice wavering with emotion. "I turned away all the suitors and princes who wanted to marry me because of you. I held on to our promises, your promises. You swore that one day I would be your queen, that together we would fulfill our dreams," Zalora said, tears now streaming down her face. Chanty's gaze flickered between Zalora and Vasper, her heart aching as jealousy twisted within her. The history between them was undeniable, and the pain it brought Chanty was something she couldn't suppress. Lauren, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy Chanty's reaction, her smirk betraying her satisfaction. Vasper's eyes softened as he looked at Chanty, silently pleading for her understanding. "Vasper, I'm going inside. I don't need to be here." "You need to talk to Zalora, just the two of you," Chanty said, turning to leave. But Vasper caught her wrist, stopping her. "No. Please stay with me," Vasper pleaded, his voice firm yet vulnerable. Zalora's anger flared at his words, her frustration palpable. "Zalora, go home. How many times do I need to tell you that everything I said back then meant nothing to me?" Vasper's tone was sharp and unyielding. "Do you think I would have stayed away for over 20 years, unable to see you, if you were still important to me?" he added bluntly. Zalora's body trembled with fury as she lunged toward Vasper, but the envoy guards quickly restrained her with their tridents, suspending her in midair. Lauren's glare remained fixed on Chanty, her concern for Zalora momentarily overshadowed by her disgust toward Chanty. Chanty stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as she watched the chaos unfold. Vasper's stern gaze remained locked on Zalora as the envoy guards slowly released her, allowing her to move again. Zalora's voice shook with rage as she cried, "You will never be forgiven by my family, Vasper. This is why my family will sever all ties with your kingdom. You will regret what you've done to me, and I will finish her," she screamed, pointing at Chanty. Vasper's deep voice cut through the tension as he brushed Zalora's hand aside. "Don't point at my fiancée, Zalora. She has a name," he said coldly. Zalora's eyes blazed with fury as she looked at Vasper and Chanty, her lips trembling in rage. Her beauty, once regal, was now tinged with raw pain and unrestrained anger. Tears streamed down her face, emotions she had long suppressed finally breaking free. Vasper's expression remained stony, devoid of emotion. He looked at Zalora and said, "Did I ever tell you I loved you even once?" "No, I didn't. I never said those words because what I felt for you was nothing more than physical attraction. That ended a long time ago." Zalora's scream echoed through the hallway, her anguish reverberating in every corner. "I hate you. I swear, if it weren't for these envoys, I don't know what I would do to her. I can't even say her name because of how much I despise her." Zalora's outburst caused Chanty's body to tremble as her tears fell freely. Overwhelmed, Chanty pushed against Vasper's chest, desperate to retreat into the room. Lauren watched her with a sneer of disdain, while Zalora's hatred boiled over. "Zalora, go home," Vasper commanded, pointing toward her vehicle nearby. Zalora's defiant gaze burned into Vasper and Chanty, refusing to waver. Chanty, teary-eyed, looked at Zalora's face, a striking contrast of beauty and unyielding fury. "I'll take Dagon," Zalora said suddenly, referring to Vasper's dragon companion. Her tone was firm, her intent clear. Vasper stared at her, his expression unchanging. "He's yours, Zalora, if that's what you want," Vasper replied. Zalora's voice softened as she spoke again, almost pleading, "So many of our memories were with Dagon, Vasper. He's witnessed everything we've done together here in the inner world," Zalora said, and Chanty continued to cry silently, her gaze fixed on Zalora. "Vasper, let me go. Please," Chanty pleaded. But instead of letting her leave, Vasper swept her into his arms. His voice rang with authority as he commanded, "Everyone, return to your homes." He pushed open the door to their room and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him. Outside the closed door, Zalora stood trembling with rage, her eyes filled with anguish as she stared at the barrier that now permanently separated her from the room. Lauren was similarly shaking in fury at Chanty, while Mara's face showed deep concern for her mistress. The envoys remained stationed nearby, prepared to intervene if necessary, waiting for Zalora and Lauren to leave. Inside, Chanty lay on the bed, crying uncontrollably, hugging a pillow tightly. Her sobs were filled with pain, her tears flowing endlessly. Vasper stood silently, his expression shadowed by guilt and sorrow as he watched her. All the pain caused by his past mistakes seemed to crash down onto Chanty. His anger at himself simmered, a self-directed fury that he couldn't escape. Unable to bear the sight of Chanty suffering any longer, Vasper moved toward her. Gently but firmly, he pulled her closer, lifting her into his arms despite her weak resistance. Chanty tried to push him away, refusing his touch, but Vasper was persistent, not letting go until they were lying side by side. His arms wrapped around her as he whispered softly into her ear, "Please, let me hold you. Even if you're tired of hearing it, I'm begging for your forgiveness, for all the pain I've caused you because of my past. Please, forgive me." Chanty continued to sob, unable to speak as her emotions overwhelmed her. It wasn't just Zalora's words that hurt her, it was hearing the history between Zalora and Vasper that reopened wounds she didn't know still existed. She looked up at Vasper, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. He gazed back with tenderness, brushing strands of hair stuck to her cheeks and gently wiping her tears with the corner of the blanket. "I'm so sorry," Vasper said, his voice breaking. "Please, learn to ignore them. I can't control what they think, like Lauren, for example. There's nothing between us, yet look at how she acts. Please, don't let them get to you, okay?" He cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears, and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her lips. As their lips met, Chanty's tears flowed anew. She instinctively wiped them with her free hand, drawing Vasper's attention to her wedding ring. A flicker of determination crossed his face as he sat up, still holding her. He took her hand, lifting it as he stared at the ring. Without a word, he carefully slid the ring off her finger. Chanty didn't resist at first, letting him take it, but as he slipped it into his pocket, she snatched it back. "I'll return this to Jake myself, Vasper, not you," Chanty said firmly, clutching the ring in her fist. Vasper looked at her hand, the strength of her grip, and felt a pang of jealousy and pain. Her fierce determination to protect that ring spoke volumes. "I'll talk to Jake," Chanty said softly, her voice calm but resolute. Vasper's heart clenched at her words. Though he understood her intention, jealousy burned through him. "I don't want you to see Jake," Vasper said quietly. Chanty's gaze hardened as she looked at him. "Don't take this the wrong way, but I don't want to hear your objections. You have nothing to fear from Jake. He has no choice in his destiny now. He's returned to his role as a guardian. What are you afraid of? King Elander Valinor is your ally, and fate itself stands on your side. I've already chosen you, Vasper." Despite her reassurance, Vasper wasn't satisfied. "That's all? Is that the only reason you're with me?" he asked, his voice tinged with insecurity. Chanty fell silent, unsure how to answer. Vasper's anxiety deepened at her lack of response. "Silence means yes," he murmured. "Please, tell me you're mine. Tell me Jake can't take you back from me. Please." His voice cracked with desperation, his hands trembling as they held hers. "Vasper," Chanty began, her voice steady, "Jake and I have no choice, our paths are set. There's nothing left between us. What are you so afraid of? I've chosen you." Vasper's eyes searched hers, unsatisfied by her words. "That's all? Is that really the reason you chose me?" he pressed. Chanty shifted, trying to deflect the conversation. "Why did you leave someone as beautiful as Zalora, Vasper? How could you just abandon her?" she asked, steering the topic away. Vasper stared at her, unflinching. "One day, I just realized I didn't want her anymore. I got tired of her," he answered bluntly. Chanty's jaw dropped at his straightforwardness. "You can grow tired of a woman that easily?" she asked, stunned. "I never loved her," Vasper replied. "There's a difference between physical attraction and real love. What we had wasn't love." His gaze softened as he looked at Chanty, his voice filled with emotion. "You're different." Chanty frowned. "She waited for you, Vasper. She held on to hope. Is that how you are? You just leave without a word, without giving them closure? Like what you did to Samara and me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vasper grew serious. "Yes," he admitted. "That's who I was, cruel and heartless. I didn't care about their feelings. It's only now, seeing you suffer because of my past, that I've realized the weight of my sins. and I'm begging for your forgiveness, my queen. He lowered his head and kissed her hand gently. As for Zalora's challenges to you, don't worry. You don't need to play along with her whims. Chanty's expression turned firm. Vasper, I'm not afraid of her. I've lived my life, and I'm not running from it. I'll face whatever comes. Her tone was steady, her resolve unwavering. Vasper could only look at her in silence, his heart caught between admiration and guilt. Chanty gazed out the window, her sigh deep and heavy. Vasper watched her, puzzled. Gently, he turned her face to meet his. Why? He asked in his deep, resonant voice. Chanty locked eyes with him, her gaze unwavering. Maybe the time will come when I'll be just like them, like Samara, Zalora, when you'll grow tired of me too, she said softly. Vasper's mouth fell open in astonishment, a laugh threatening to escape as he looked at her. Chanty's face darkened, displeased by his reaction. Maybe it'll be the other way around, huh? You're the one who left me, after all. I begged and begged for you to come back, but you still chose Jake. I chased after you like a fool, like a shadow that wouldn't leave your side. If we hadn't ended up here in the inner world, would you even have come back to me? Vasper's voice was steady, but there was pain in his eyes as he caressed Chanty's hand and pressed a tender kiss to it, his gaze full of love and longing. Chanty stayed silent, her eyes fixed on him. Did they really have to threaten my life just to bring you back to me? Vasper whispered, his voice barely audible. Still, Chanty said nothing. What you did to me, Vasper, is something I can never forgive, Chanty finally said, her voice firm. You slept with another woman just days before our wedding. Do you even know what that did to me? I died that day, Vasper Mondragon, for your information. Her expression hardened, anger flickering in her eyes. Now it was Vasper's turn to fall silent. You had already drunk the magic wine, he said, his voice low, regret evident in every word. That's what I felt, what you felt in that moment. For the last time, my queen, I'm begging for your forgiveness. I regret everything, and I've suffered so much since losing you. Seeing you with Jake, seeing you in his arms, it was my death too. Especially when I saw the two of you on that bed. I saw it all through your memories. Chanty's cheeks burned with shame. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. But Vasper gently lifted her chin, making their eyes meet once more. Can we not let those chapters of our lives dictate what we have now? I want to start over with you. And I'm so deeply grateful that you've accepted me again. My love for you, my queen, is something I've never felt before, not for anyone. Only for you. For the first time, I've gone mad over a woman. I've been used to women going crazy for me, losing sleep because of me. But with you, it's the other way around. I'm the one who can't sleep, thinking only of you. I'm the one who's gone mad, consumed by thoughts of you. His words were filled with such sincerity that Chanty was left speechless, her heart stirring at the truth behind them. Despite herself, a warmth spread in her chest as she listened, though tears brimmed in her eyes. My queen, Vasper continued, his voice soft and unwavering, you are the only woman I've ever loved like this. And you're the only woman who's caused me pain so deep that I can hardly bear it. Tears rolled down Chanty's cheeks as she looked at him. Vasper, I feel the same way, she whispered. But what weighs heavy on me now is the fact that I've hurt someone else. Jake. Because of what you did, he and I created our own memories, our own paradise. Her voice broke, and Vasper's hand clenched tightly into a fist. Jealousy and pain flashed in his eyes as he listened to her words. And now, Chanty sobbed, I know I'm going to break his heart. I don't want to hurt anyone. Her tears fell freely now as she cried, her voice trembling. Vasper pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as though trying to shield her from her own pain. Please, stop, he begged, his voice raw with emotion. Your words, they're like knives piercing my heart. I can't bear it anymore. Chanty quieted in his embrace, her sobs subsiding into silence. After a long moment, she pulled away, looking down at the ring Jake had given her, which she now held in her palm. Vasper reached out to take it, but Chanty closed her hand around it tightly. The jealousy and hurt on Vasper's face were undeniable, but so too was the understanding and love that shone in his eyes. He knew, deep down, that everything that had led them to this moment was his fault. And that knowledge weighed on him more than anything else. When the device sounded again, Mara's voice came through, saying, "Miss Chanty, the guardians are outside waiting for you." Hearing this, Chanty jumped up, quickly straightened her clothes and hair, and hurriedly got off the bed. Her nervousness was evident. Could Jake be with them? She wondered, glancing at the ring on her hand. Vasper, observing her reaction, asked, "Are you excited to see Jake?" Chanty stared at him, questioning whether he was serious. Choosing not to answer, she remained silent. Vasper's forehead creased further, his seriousness deepening. Grabbing Chanty's waist, he pulled her close. She looked up at him, her expression conflicted, and together, they began walking toward the door. When Vasper opened it, they were met by 7 guardians standing tall and exuding an undeniable, commanding presence. Dressed in formal suits, their expressions were stern. However, Jake stood out the most, his sharp gaze fixed on Vasper, who still held Chanty by the waist. Jake and Chanty's eyes met, locking in a serious, wordless exchange. Vasper, noticing the connection, felt a surge of jealousy. To break the tension, he addressed David. "What brings you here, David?" Vasper's voice carried irritation. Meanwhile, Chanty spotted Mara standing off to the side with the 6 envoys. David stepped forward, his demeanor composed but resolute. "We've come to take Chanty to the camp outside your kingdom, Velantis. It's our responsibility to support her in her fight. That's our duty, and we hope you'll respect that," David declared firmly. Vasper's stern gaze met David's, neither man backing down. Meanwhile, Jake and Chanty continued their intense eye contact. Finally, Vasper nodded reluctantly. "All right, David. Have it your way, but I'm coming with you in the vehicle." At this, Jake let out a faint, mocking laugh, audible to everyone. Irritated, Vasper snapped, "What's so funny, Jake? Is there a problem?" Chanty turned to Vasper, speaking softly, "David and the others will handle this. Please, Vasper." This quiet interaction between Chanty and Vasper seemed to irritate Jake further. He averted his gaze, unable to watch their soft-spoken exchange. The other guardians noticed Jake's reaction but remained professional. Vasper, however, took Chanty's right hand, the one holding her wedding ring. Looking at David, he said, "Chanty has something she needs to return to Jake." He tightened his grip on her hand, her knuckles whitening as she trembled, unsure what to say to Jake. Jake's sharp glare was fixed on Vasper, his teeth clenched. He seemed to already know what was in Chanty's hand. His own fists tightened, and Jacob, standing nearby, placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Relax, bro," Jacob said, attempting to calm him. David stood in silence, waiting for Chanty. Slowly, she approached Jake, her movements hesitant. Vasper stayed alert, watching closely. Jake's expression was a mixture of pain and love, his furrowed brows reflecting his inner turmoil. When their eyes met, it seemed as though the sky itself had fallen upon Jake, who now understood the gravity of the moment. "My love, please don't," Jake pleaded softly, his voice filled with desperation. Chanty froze, staring at him, unable to move or speak. Vasper, his teeth grinding in frustration, watched the scene unfold. The 6 guardians, sensing the rising tension, remained on high alert, their eyes darting between Jake and Vasper. Even Mara, standing at a distance, observed the unfolding drama. "My love," Jake continued, his voice tender, "just keep it for now. Soon enough, it will find its way back to your finger where it belongs. Please, don't do this. There's still a chance for us, wait for the right time. I'll do everything to bring us back to the way things were. We'll return to our mansion, to our life." Hearing Jake's heartfelt plea, tears streamed down Chanty's face. The guardians, though stone-faced, could feel the weight of Jake's emotions, his words resonating deeply. David remained silent, watching Jake with understanding. Vasper, unable to bear it any longer, stepped forward. Without hesitation, he snatched the ring from Chanty's hand and threw it at Jake. The ring hit Jake's chest before falling to the ground. This act from Vasper ignited immediate tension. The Guardians instantly went on high alert. Jake's reaction was swift. He lunged at Vasper in anger. Although none of them could use their powers due to being in the Sylvan Concord, the envoys quickly intervened, suspending Jake midair before he could land a blow. Jake struggled against the invisible force, his rage evident. Meanwhile, Chanty stood frozen, her tears falling as she stared at the blue sapphire ring encircled by diamonds now lying on the floor. Its dazzling brilliance caught everyone's attention, everyone except Vasper, who remained cold. The Guardians tensed, their eyes fixed on Jake, ready for a fight. Mara, standing at the edge of the scene, watched in discomfort, her gaze flickering between Chanty and the ring. Then slowly the envoys released Jake just enough to let him speak. "My love, just hold on to it," Jake pleaded again, his voice softer now but no less filled with emotion. "That ring belongs to you, and one day it will be on your finger again. There's no end for us, wait for the right time, and I'll bring you back to me." Tears continued to stream down Chanty's face, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. Jake's voice cracked as he added, "Please, wait for me. I'll do everything in my power to make things right. Just give me time." The Guardians, though stoic, felt the heartbreak emanating from Jake and Chanty. David remained quiet, but his expression betrayed his understanding of the pain both were enduring. Vasper, however, showed no sympathy. He strode over to the ring, picked it up, and threw it at Jake's feet with disdain. "If you want it so badly, take it," he said coldly, his action escalating the tension between the two men. Jake's anguish turned to fury. The moment was thick with emotion, the air practically vibrating with the suppressed feelings of everyone present. Vasper watched Jake's powerful stunts, ready to retaliate but restrained himself when Chanty grabbed his arm to hold him back. The envoys moved Jake's suspended body closer to the vehicles. "Don't let him go until we're out of here," David commanded the envoys. Chanty released Vasper's arm to pick up the ring, but Vasper stopped her. "Let them pick it up and return it to Jake," Vasper said firmly. Chanty's eyes protested as she looked at him, but Vasper had no intention of letting her go. Justin stepped forward, picked up the ring, and glanced at Chanty. "Don't worry, Chanty, I'll make sure this gets back to Jake," Justin assured her. He approached Jake, still suspended in the air, and slipped the ring into Jake's pocket. Everyone watched the gesture closely, but Justin stayed by Jake's side. David turned to Vasper. "If you come with us, it will only increase the tension. Can't we handle this ourselves, Vasper?" "No, especially not with Jake," Vasper responded firmly. David sighed deeply. "Mara, prepare Chanty's things," he instructed. Mara nodded quickly and rushed into Chanty's room to gather her belongings for the battle camp. Chanty, filled with worry, glanced between Jake and David. "David, remember what we discussed?" "Why are you bringing him with you?" she asked. David looked at her. "No one can dictate his decisions, Chanty. His will is stronger than stone," he replied. Chanty turned her gaze to Jake and David again. "I want to talk to him, David," she requested. David glanced at Jake. "If he behaves, fine." David moved closer to Jake, while Chanty approached Vasper. "Let me talk to him," she insisted. Vasper said nothing, though his face showed clear discomfort. Chanty didn't wait for his answer. She turned and walked toward Jake, who remained suspended in midair, flanked by Justin and David. She knew Jake could see and hear her but couldn't move due to the envoy's telekinetic hold using their tridents. "Jake, please don't go to Velantis. Remember what I asked you before? If possible, don't go there," she pleaded. Chanty then looked at David. "David, can you release him for just a moment?" she asked. David looked at Jake. "Jake, don't do anything stupid and cause problems. Just talk," he said with authority. David signaled the envoys, who gradually released their hold on Jake. Slowly, Jake moved, and as soon as he could, he pulled Chanty into a tight embrace. Everyone watching was stunned. Vasper reacted immediately, attempting to move closer, but the alert envoys restrained him, suspending him in place just as Jake had been moments before. Vasper could hear and see but was unable to move. Jake held Chanty tightly. "I miss you so much, my love," he said, finally letting go to look into her tearful eyes. Chanty said nothing, trying to suppress her emotions. "Please, don't return our wedding ring," Jake pleaded, his voice full of desperation. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the ring, and slid it back onto her finger. They both stared at her hand, now adorned again with the sapphire wedding ring. The guardians, though stoic, were visibly moved by the scene. However, they remained alert, particularly toward Vasper. "Jake, you know what you just did is against the rules," David said authoritatively. "Don't forget to discipline yourself." Jake ignored David, wiping Chanty's tears. "Please, let's follow the king's decree so we can live in peace. Then, legally, our marriage will stand again," he urged, gazing at Chanty. Chanty looked at him seriously. "Jake, I know it's hard to accept now, but eventually, we'll learn to embrace what fate has given us," she said, wiping her own tears. Jake remained silent, staring at her. "Please, tell me you're still mine. My love, please. We should start over, right?" Jake implored. Chanty stayed silent, unable to answer. "Jake, please, don't go to Velantis. Stay here," she begged again. Jake shook his head. "No, I can't let you fight alone there while I do nothing. I have to be by your side," he insisted. Chanty remained silent. "Chanty, that's enough." "Look at Vasper," David interjected, nodding toward Vasper, who was visibly straining against the envoy's power. He was close to breaking free. Chanty knew chaos would follow if Vasper managed to escape. She turned to David. "Let Vasper and me handle this, David. You all leave first to avoid trouble," she suggested. Jake stared daggers at Vasper. "I can't wait to end his life for us," Jake muttered angrily. Vasper's eyes burned with fury as they locked on Jake's. David signaled the guardians to board the vehicle, pulling Jake along. Justin grabbed Jake's arm, urging him inside. Chanty turned away from Jake, walking toward Vasper, though Jake continued to watch her with jealousy and heartbreak. He felt the growing coldness in Chanty's demeanor toward him. The vehicle doors closed. Jake stood motionless, staring out as the vehicle teleported away, leaving Chanty and the envoys behind. The envoys released Vasper, who had been straining against their hold. The moment he was free, Vasper rushed to Chanty and embraced her tightly. Chanty broke down in tears as Vasper gently stroked her hair, filled with concern. Outside Chanty's room, the envoys returned to their posts, standing guard while Chanty wept in Vasper's arms. Vasper embraced Chanty as tears streamed down her face, wiping them gently with his hands. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me if I couldn't control myself. I was just scared that your mind might change again and you'd choose Jake once more," Vasper said, his voice trembling with worry, fearing he might lose Chanty all over again. Taking the wedding ring off Chanty's finger, Vasper added, "And this ring, holding it firmly, I'll return it so Mara herself can deliver it to Jake." His voice carried a mix of determination and anguish as he clutched the ring in his hand. Chanty, overwhelmed by Vasper's aggressive actions and the panic evident in his voice, could only remain silent. She hadn't expected Vasper to act this way in front of her, and she didn't want to worsen the anxiety he was already feeling. "Vasper, I need to go to the camp." "I promised David I would go," Chanty said softly as she turned to walk toward her room. Vasper followed her, now understanding the situation. "I understand. Don't worry, I'll take you there," he replied, his voice calm and full of reassurance. Meanwhile, Mara was arranging Chanty's belongings in a large black suitcase. Chanty glanced at the suitcase and was reminded it was the same one from Jake's mansion. "Vasper, give me the ring." "I'll keep it," Chanty said, holding out her palm in front of Vasper, waiting for him to hand it over. But Vasper didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Mara and said, "Mara, I have something for you to deliver to Jake's quarters." His gaze was firm as he handed the ring to Mara, who hesitated for a moment, trembling as she looked at the ring and then at Chanty. Chanty and Vasper locked eyes, tension hanging thick between them. Chanty eventually surrendered, lowering her hand to her side. Mara, make sure that ring returns to Jake's possession, Vasper added, his tone authoritative. Mara nodded and replied, yes, your majesty, it will be done. She opened the door as two elven staff entered to carry Chanty's suitcase out to the vehicle. Chanty and Vasper continued to stare at each other, their silence heavy. Chanty was the first to move, heading toward her closet to find something to change into for the camp. But before she could, Vasper approached her from behind and wrapped his arms around her. Are you angry with me? He asked softly, his voice tender. Chanty didn't answer. I'm leaving, Vasper. You can go back to your place. You can't come with me. Jake will be there, and you'll see him again, she said in a cold, detached tone. Vasper winced at her words, the pain evident in his expression. Don't I have the right to be jealous? He countered. Chanty, unmoved, tried to remove his hands from around her, but Vasper tightened his embrace, refusing to let go. I won't let you go until I hear the words I need to hear from you, Vasper said firmly. Chanty furrowed her brows. What words? She asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Do I have the right to be jealous? Vasper added, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. Chanty fell silent. I don't have peace of mind, Vasper admitted. Chanty turned to face him fully, her gaze locking onto his. Vasper, do I even have a choice after everything? I don't. None at all, she replied. Vasper's expression grew serious, his dissatisfaction evident despite her response. Is that all? Because you don't have a choice, he asked pointedly. For a moment, Chanty was quiet. Then she said, Vasper, you don't need to be jealous of Jake. Even if I wanted to go back to him, I can't. I've made my final decision to choose you. But everything that happened between Jake and me, it still hurts. I didn't want to hurt him, but I ended up causing him pain. I don't want anything bad to happen to him, she said, her voice trembling as she stared into Vasper's eyes, which reflected the pain her words caused. I love Jake. He's still my husband, even if fate didn't align for the two of us. I'm still married to him, Chanty admitted. Vasper released her, turning away and biting his lower lip in frustration. Chanty, unable to hold back her emotions, began to cry as she looked at him. I can't simply erase him from my heart, even though I chose you, Vasper. I still feel compassion for Jake. I can't force myself to forget him completely, she said through her tears. Hearing this, Vasper turned back to her, his eyes glistening as if on the verge of tears. But you don't need to be jealous because I don't have a choice anymore but to stand by my decisions. I don't want Jake to get hurt, but I don't want to lose you either, she said, her voice breaking as her emotions overwhelmed her. Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace. It's my fault. All of this is my fault. It's my fault Jake claimed a part of your heart that should have belonged only to me, he said, his grip tightening as tears streamed down his face. Please forgive me. Forgive me, he whispered tenderly. Minutes passed, and Chanty's sobs subsided. Suddenly, Vasper tilted her face up and claimed her lips in a passionate kiss. Between kisses, he murmured, we'll meet again in Velantis. Chanty didn't respond. As they exited the room, Mara and 6 envoys were waiting. Vasper escorted Chanty to the vehicle, then turned to Mara and said, Mara, when Chanty returns here, she will no longer accept visitors like Zalora, Lauren, and especially Jake. His declaration shocked Chanty. Mara simply nodded and bowed to Vasper, then to Chanty, before closing the vehicle door. Vasper watched as Chanty, filled with worry, disappeared into the vehicle that teleported to the camp. When the vehicle arrived, Chanty glanced out the window and was shocked by what she saw. A vast desert stretched out before her, and gathered there were countless elves dressed in royal uniforms of green and yellow. Each soldier carried a trident, similar to those wielded by the envoys escorting her. At the center of the formation stood a massive tent bearing the emblem of the Sylvan Concord, where the vehicle stopped. The envoys carried Chanty's suitcase into the large tent. As she stepped out, Chanty noticed the soldiers watching her every move, and the sight unsettled her. Why are there so many soldiers here? Are they preparing for war? She wondered, her gaze drifting to the horizon, where she saw hundreds of Sylvan Concord vehicles stationed in neat rows. No one explained the larger context to Chanty. She was left in the dark about the looming event known as the Twilight Reckoning. Inside the tent, 7 guardians and Jake stood, waiting. Jake's posture betrayed his restraint, his desire to approach her held back by the presence of other high-ranking entities. David approached her with a welcoming smile. I'm glad you're here. You'll be with us as part of our plan for the Twilight Reckoning. We only have 12 hours to complete the mission. If we fail, we'll have to wait years before we can attempt this again, he said gravely. Chanty, overwhelmed, turned to David. David, what's with all the soldiers outside? And the countless vehicles? She asked, her voice filled with curiosity and unease. David's expression grew stern. We are prepared for war, Chanty. The Velantis Noctem has allied forces defending their kingdom. If your mission succeeds, they'll retreat. But if not, we'll face them in battle. Your focus is on Alexander Mondragon. Other challengers from allied kingdoms will assist you in defeating him. Whoever prevails, be it a king or queen, will take his throne as part of their victory. Chanty glanced at Jake, who was watching her with a serious expression. Yet, in his eyes, she saw longing and a desire to be close to her. She felt the weight of his gaze but also the tension caused by the other officials present. David, can we talk alone? Somewhere no one can hear us? Chanty asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded at the other officials. We're no longer bound by the Sylvan Concord's restrictions. Our powers and heightened senses are restored, Chanty, he explained. Chanty sighed, overwhelmed by the implications. Silently, she allowed herself to be guided by an envoy to her private quarters. The interior of the tent was luxurious, with a single comfortable bed, a round table, and a cool atmosphere. Yet outside, the commotion of soldiers and their preparations for battle filled the air. As Chanty sat on the bed, she thought about Jake and the prophecy. Fear gnawed at her heart, the fear that something terrible might happen to Jake. Above all, she dreaded the possibility of his death at the hands of Alexander Mondragon. Unconsciously, she whispered his name. Jake, please don't do this, she murmured, her voice trembling. With a deep sigh, she lay back on the bed, the weight of her emotions pressing heavily on her chest. Suddenly, she heard Jake's voice outside the tent. David, I'll head to the other tent, he said. Though she couldn't hear David's reply, his voice carried on about war formations and strategies. Moments later, Jake appeared silently at her bedside, motioning for her to stay quiet. Chanty's eyes widened in shock as her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Before she could react, Jake quickly took her hand and teleported them out of the room. Several hours passed, and Vasper Mondragon arrived at David's tent. His presence immediately put everyone on high alert, especially the soldiers whose tridents were aimed squarely at him as he stood in the center. His posture exuded power, his aura commanding attention despite his plain attire, a simple black t-shirt and tight, tattered pants, which seemed far too casual for someone stepping into a war against his own kingdom. Vasper's sharp gaze landed on David, unfazed by the 6 guardians surrounding him with unrelenting vigilance. The tension in the room rose swiftly, crackling in the air like static as their energies clashed. Jacob, standing at the front, addressed Vasper with an unwavering glare full of quiet fury. Vasper Mondragon. It's surprising your father allowed you to leave and approach our tent. Don't expect us to treat you the same way the Sylvan Concord does, or with the courtesy you're used to, Jacob said, his tone biting. Vasper ignored him, his piercing gaze scanning the room, searching for any trace of Chanty or Jake. But he found none. Turning his attention to David, his voice was calm but laced with impatience. David, where is Chanty? David stepped closer, matching Vasper's intense stare with one of his own. Both men radiated power, their auras clashing like thunderclouds. Vasper, we're at war. Focus on your fighters. The woman can wait, David said, his tone steady yet firm, each word deliberate. A sarcastic smirk tugged at Vasper's lips. "David, you know me, don't you? I don't care who wins or loses. Wars have raged in the inner world countless times. Have you ever seen me care? No, you haven't. I only care about Chanty and her fight. Everything else? Irrelevant. Now, where is she?" His words were direct, slicing through the rising tension like a blade. Jacob's frustration boiled over, and blue flames ignited at his fingertips, swirling ominously. The guardians and soldiers noticed the sudden spike in energy, their bodies instinctively tensing. Lewis placed a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder to calm him, but Jacob's glare never left Vasper. "You think we'll tell you where she is?" Marco interjected with a mocking laugh. "What's the matter, Vasper? Is your power failing you? Can't you sense her energy anymore?" Justin chimed in with a smirk. "So it's true, your strength has weakened." The room fell silent, a collective unease settling over them as each began focusing their senses to trace Chanty's energy. Suddenly, David's expression shifted, a flicker of worry crossing his face. He leaned toward Justin and whispered, "Find Jake in the other tent he mentioned earlier." "Now." Justin nodded and swiftly left the tent to search for Jake. Vasper's sharp senses caught David's whispered command, and his expression darkened. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening as he fixed David with a searing glare. "David, where is Chanty?" he demanded, his voice low but deadly, a growl underlining his words. The guardians and soldiers stood on edge, their eyes darting between Vasper and David, waiting for the inevitable clash. But David remained silent, his unyielding stare meeting Vasper's. Suddenly, Vasper vanished from his spot in front of them. The tension in the room spiked as everyone scrambled to locate his presence. David's sharp eyes flicked toward Chanty's room, and with a quick nod, Lewis moved to check it. As Lewis entered the room, he found Vasper standing beside the bed, glaring at him with eyes blazing with fury. Chanty was nowhere to be found. "He took her!" Vasper roared, his voice reverberating through the tent. "Where is she?" he demanded, his teeth gritted, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. Lewis stood firm, unfazed by Vasper's rage. The guardians quickly gathered in the room, surrounding Vasper with unspoken tension crackling in the air. It was clear to everyone that Jake had taken Chanty. His absence from the other tent and the camp area made it undeniable. "Where is he, David?" Vasper asked again, his voice dangerously low, his anger simmering just below the surface. The 6 guardians stood beside David, their stances alert, ready for anything. David stepped closer to Vasper, their gazes locking like steel clashing against steel. "You know Jake just as well as I do," David said, his voice cold. "You're both hard-headed fools who never listen. If I could, I'd smash both your skulls together to knock some sense into you." Each word was laced with restrained anger. Justin chuckled at David's bluntness, but Vasper remained silent, his eyes narrowing at David. Without another word, Vasper disappeared, teleporting away in a flash of anger. David's eyes fell to the bed as his body trembled with fury. He had trusted Jake not to make reckless moves, especially ones that would jeopardize their plans and unity. Despite Jake's mistakes, David couldn't bring himself to impose severe punishment. To him, Jake was not just a fellow guardian, he was a brother. Unable to contain his frustration, David punched the air, his energy rippling through the room. The other guardians watched him in silence, understanding the weight of his emotions. "Who's volunteering to beat the hell out of Jake when he gets back?" David growled through gritted teeth. Marco smirked. "Let's feed him to the dragons." Justin laughed. "And who'll do the feeding?" "You." Marco fell silent, earning a chuckle from Justin. Jacob, however, stepped forward, his gaze sharp and knowing. "I think I know where they are," Jacob said quietly. David turned to him, his expression a mix of relief and anger. "Then go. Take the others and find them," he ordered, storming out of the room. The 5 guardians followed Jacob to their vehicle, mounting it swiftly as they headed toward the place Jacob suspected Jake had taken Chanty. Their mission was clear: bring them back, and deal with Jake's stubbornness later. Meanwhile, Jake and Chanty faced each other, tears streaming from both their eyes. Jake knelt before Chanty, who sat on a single cedar sofa. He was in the space between her knees, gazing up at her face, both of them crying. Chanty tried to suppress her sobs as she looked at Jake, while he wept uncontrollably, burying his face in her abdomen and clinging to her waist. Jake poured out all his pain, frustration, and heartache over their situation, and Chanty simply let him, allowing him to release his emotions while she quietly endured her own turmoil. "I can't bear to lose you," Jake said, his voice breaking as he looked up at Chanty with tear-streaked eyes. "What do I have to do to change your mind? Please, tell me. I'll do anything." He clasped her hands in his, kissing them repeatedly, tears falling with every kiss. Chanty cried even harder, her heart breaking as she stared down at him. "I love you so much. You're my life, I can't live without you," Jake added desperately. Chanty, overwhelmed with pity for him, turned her gaze away toward the wall, unable to look at his grief-stricken face. "Jake," Chanty whispered, her voice trembling, "I'd rather you hated me. I'm so broken I can't be healed. There are things we can't force because they're simply impossible. I can't choose you if it means you'll suffer your whole life alongside the dragons. I can't bear to be the cause of your pain. You don't understand what the king is capable of if I defy his will." Her voice cracked, her sobs intensifying. "And most of all, Jake, I can't lose Vasper." Her words were followed by a loud, gut-wrenching cry. "I'm so sorry. I'm so stupid and cruel to you. I'll accept whatever punishment you give me, Jake. Please, forgive me. But I can't lose him, I just can't. I still love him." Chanty covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably after bearing the truth of her emotions. Jake clenched his fists tightly against the cushion of the sofa, his forehead pressed against her stomach as his pain consumed him. The anguish he felt was as if the heavens themselves were crushing him. Unable to take it anymore, Jake stood, pulling Chanty into a tight embrace. He lifted her with him as they both cried loudly, their sobs echoing through the room. Chanty didn't resist, letting him hold her, but she didn't reciprocate the hug. She felt that in that moment, it was better to end this chapter of their lives as husband and wife and accept the bitter truth that no matter what they did, fate wouldn't allow them to be together. After a while, their tears subsided, and Jake slowly loosened his hold on Chanty. He looked at her, wiping away her tears with his hands. "You know you're my life. You're the only happiness I have in this world. I can't let you go. If Vasper is willing to fight for you, even against our marriage, then I won't give up on you either," Jake said, his voice resolute. "Until the day I die, my love will be only for you. I'll do everything to carry out King Elander's plan. That's the only way to be with you again, to make it legal. Then we can fulfill our dreams, right? Don't you want us to have children? To live in our mansion, fulfilling all our plans together?" His gaze was intense, filled with determination, but Chanty remained silent, staring at him in disbelief. It was clear that Jake wouldn't accept her decision to choose Vasper. He would go through with King Elander's plan to defeat Vasper Mondragon. Chanty took a small step back, distancing herself from Jake. He stared at her seriously, trying to understand her emotions. "Jake, I can't do that," Chanty said, her voice quivering. "I can't follow King Elander's plan. I just can't, Jake." She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes again. Jake gave her a bitter smile. "I know. Don't worry. David and I, along with the others, will take care of Vasper. You don't need to be involved," he said, revealing his intentions. Chanty gasped, staring at Jake in shock. "No. Jake, I don't want you to do that to Vasper. I won't allow it," she exclaimed, her voice filled with desperation. Jake's face hardened as he looked at her. "If I don't, I'll never get you back. I have no other choice, Chanty. Forgive me, but I can't just hand you back to him like that. I'll endure this short time of you being with him, but in the end, you'll return to me, not to him," Jake said firmly. Chanty shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Jake, I won't forgive you if you do that." Jake's eyes burned with anger. And I won't forgive myself if I let you go, Chanty, he shouted, his voice thundering through the room. Chanty flinched, trembling as she stepped back. It was the first time she had heard Jake yell like that, and the sheer force of his voice shook her to her core. Jake, realizing what he had done, softened his expression and looked at her with regret. He reached out to touch her, but she pushed his hand away. I'm so sorry, my love. Please, forgive me. I didn't mean to raise my voice. I'm not angry with you. I was just expressing what I feel inside, Jake said, his voice pleading as he tried to calm her. Chanty suddenly turned away and ran toward the door. She didn't want to argue with Jake at that moment, knowing he wouldn't listen to her. But before she could reach the door, Jake caught up to her. My love, please, listen to me. I'm so sorry. Please, forgive me, Jake said as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. Chanty struggled to remove his hands that held her tightly. Jake, take me back to the tent. David and the others are surely looking for us by now, Chanty said in a calm tone, though in truth, fear was creeping into her. Her body trembled, and even her voice quivered slightly despite her effort to sound composed. Jake turned her around with a firm but gentle motion, making her face him. She had no choice but to meet his desperate and pleading gaze, which begged for her understanding. My love, don't worry. We still have 12 hours before twilight. We still have time, Jake said. Jake, please take me back to the tent, Chanty pleaded softly, her voice trembling. Jake looked at her with imploring eyes. Stay with me, please. I miss you so much, he said in a deep voice, his tone carrying a mix of longing and pain. Chanty was startled by her own reaction to him at that moment. She felt something unfamiliar, something that made her afraid of Jake. But she didn't let her fear show. She forced herself to appear calm and relaxed. Jake, we've already talked about my decision. You should remember that, Chanty said firmly. Jake stared at her for a moment, as if frozen. Then he sighed and said, I understand. Don't worry. I'll play along, for now, until the time comes when I'll intervene. I can wait. His voice softened as he whispered the last part against her lips. Chanty felt the warmth of his breath, and to her surprise, her body reacted differently. Goosebumps rose on her skin, and she wondered why she suddenly felt this way toward Jake. She quickly turned her face away, avoiding the kiss Jake was about to give her. Jake, please, Chanty said, placing her palm on his chest to keep him from leaning closer. Her voice was soft, but her tone was firm. Jake bowed his head and exhaled deeply, his pain evident. And now, I'm not even allowed to kiss my wife, he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Chanty remained silent, knowing Jake was in denial. She didn't want to push him further, fearing it might trigger his anger again. Let's go, Jake. Take me back to the tent, Chanty said quietly. In that moment, Jake felt like a stranger to her. She glanced at him nervously, her sense of unease growing. Jake looked at her, his expression stern, then took her hand. Are you afraid of me? Jake asked softly. Chanty panicked internally. Should I be afraid of you, Jake? She countered, her voice trembling as she met his gaze. Their eyes locked, each trying to decipher the other's emotions and intentions. There's nothing to fear, my love. I'm still the man you married, the husband who loves you deeply, Jake said, his voice filled with tenderness. He kissed her hand, holding it to his lips for a long moment, his eyes fixed on hers. Chanty didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. Can I kiss you? Please? Jake whispered, his voice low and pleading. His words sent Chanty into a state of panic. She didn't know whether to refuse or what she should do next. Jake, please, let's go, she finally said. But before she could say more, Jake pulled her into a tight embrace and captured her lips in a fervent kiss, a devouring kiss full of hunger and longing. Chanty froze, unable to move as Jake's searing kiss overwhelmed her. She kept her lips pressed tightly together, trying to protest, but she was powerless against his intensity. When Jake finally released her lips, he didn't let her go from his embrace. His hand rested on the back of her neck, holding her head firmly in place so she couldn't turn away. I love you so much, my love. I miss you so much. I feel like I'm going crazy thinking about you, especially when you didn't choose me in front of the round table. I knew you were calling out to me. I heard you say my name. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't, Jake confessed, his voice thick with emotion. Chanty stood in shock, realizing her suspicions were true. She didn't reply, her mind racing, but Jake continued, his voice softening. And yet, even then, you kept calling his name, Vasper's name. Chanty trembled, her body frozen, unable to move. Jake, please, let me go, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow and a hint of regret. Okay, we'll go back to the tent, Jake said softly, but I want you to know this, after you're done with Alexander Mondragon, we're coming back here, my love. I missed you so much. His words were heavy with longing. Chanty remained silent, gazing at Jake's face. She felt pity for him. He was clearly in denial, unable to accept her decisions. Suddenly, loud knocking echoed from the door, followed by David's voice, yelling from the other side. Both Chanty and Jake turned to look at the door. Chanty silently thanked David and the others for arriving, though Jake's face betrayed his displeasure. Jake! If you don't open this door, I'm breaking it down. David shouted angrily. Jake clenched his jaw in frustration, striding toward the door and flinging it open. David and the other guardians stormed inside, but they all froze in shock. Their gazes locked on Chanty, who now stood beside Vasper Mondragon. Vasper's arm was firmly wrapped around Chanty's waist. Jake's fury was immediate. He stepped forward, intent on confronting them, but before he could reach Chanty and Vasper, they vanished into thin air right before everyone's eyes. Jake roared in anger, the sound echoing in the room. The guardians exchanged uneasy glances, shaking their heads at the situation. Jacob studied Jake's expression carefully, trying to assess his emotions. What's wrong with you, Jake? David asked sternly, breaking the silence. Since when did you become so stubborn? Don't you understand the king's orders? Can't you wait for your time? There's already a blueprint for the plan, Jake. And what did you do? You let your foolishness show. David's tone was sharp, his frustration boiling over. Jake glared at David, meeting his anger with his own defiance. The two men locked eyes, tension thick in the air. Marco and Justin watched with concern, exchanging nervous looks. Jake, don't let your feelings for Chanty cloud your judgment, Marco said, his voice calm but firm. Use your head. Love can drive people mad, that's what they say, right? And based on what I've observed, that's exactly where you're headed. Marco's words left everyone stunned, and they all turned to look at Jake. Jake stared back at Marco with a piercing gaze, his expression hard. Don't take it the wrong way, Jake. I'm just concerned about you, Marco added, his tone softening. David stepped forward, facing Jake directly. I don't want to be forced by the king to punish you, Jake. So stop with the recklessness. Wait for the right time, your time. Control yourself, can't you? All this just because of one woman? You've changed, Jake. You're no longer as composed and smooth as you used to be, David said, his frustration evident. Lewis chimed in, adding, yeah, Jake. Your actions are sloppy. You're letting your emotions rule you. Jake, fed up with the barrage of reprimands, turned on his heel without a word. He grabbed his leather jacket from the sofa and vanished before their eyes. Justin let out a loud laugh. Look at him now. He's so rude, didn't even say goodbye before leaving. Then again, he's always been like that, hasn't he? Leaving without warning. Justin chuckled but quickly bit back his words, realizing they might have been too harsh. David sighed deeply, trying to contain his anger, while Jacob patted his shoulder in an attempt to calm him. Gabriel, watching the scene, remarked sarcastically, if Jake becomes the leader of the Guardians, I'd rather quit. He'd be so busy with his girlfriend that he wouldn't do any work. At least I'd get to go home to mine. His comment drew laughter from everyone except David, who turned away, unwilling to engage in the joke. The group teleported back to the tent, where they found Jake sitting on the sofa with a bottle of liquor in front of him. His sharp, piercing eyes greeted them as they arrived. David followed Jake's gaze, which flickered toward the elven soldiers, who seemed uneasy under his intense stare. David noticed Jake's focus shifting toward Chanty's room, where her presence, and Vasper Mondragon's, could be sensed. This explained the dark, stormy expression on Jake's face. Jake's ears tuned into the muffled sounds of conversation coming from Chanty's room. He listened intently, his frustration growing with every passing second. David, understanding Jake's predicament, could only sigh. He knew Jake's feelings for Chanty ran deep, but Vasper's stubborn refusal to leave Chanty's side made the situation impossible to resolve. Meanwhile, Chanty and Vasper were in the room. However, Chanty was cold toward Vasper at that moment because of what had recently happened between her and Jake. She sat on the bed, hugging a pillow, as tears streamed steadily down her face. Across from her, Vasper, filled with sorrow and worry, silently watched her. Vasper had witnessed everything that transpired between Chanty and Jake. Upon hearing from Jacob and David where Jake was, he had rushed to the location and seen it all, their conversations, their emotions. Yet, he restrained himself from interfering, allowing Chanty and Jake their moment, especially after hearing Chanty bid Jake farewell, though Jake could not accept it. Vasper's chest tightened as he watched Chanty cry, knowing the tears were for Jake. It tore him apart to see the woman he loved crying over another man, but he accepted that he was to blame for all of this from the very beginning. Once, Chanty's heart had belonged solely to him, but now it was divided, with Jake occupying a part of it, a fact that brought nothing but anguish to Vasper. Chanty cried silently, avoiding making any noise, knowing Jake was just outside the room. She was aware that Jake was listening intently for any sounds coming from inside. The tension outside was palpable, like a volcano on the brink of eruption. Jake and the other guardians were gathered around a round table, discussing war strategies. They stood over a display-like table, reviewing plans for their defense against the enemies surrounding them. The Guardians led the charge in battle because of their powers and wisdom, followed by the envoys, whose tridents were formidable weapons, though even these had limitations against certain adversaries. Among their foes were various species, each with unique strengths, but the most challenging enemies were the dragon riders. These warriors, skilled in taming and commanding flying dragons, were nearly unbeatable. Most dragon riders hailed from Velantis and Isaiah, adding to the threat they posed. As David spoke, Jake's attention remained fixed on Chanty's room. Though he couldn't hear anything inside, he was aware of both Chanty and Vasper's presence. The silence made him uneasy, his curiosity growing with each passing moment. Then Justin broke the tension. "David, Vasper Mondragon is in that room. Are you sure it's wise for us to discuss strategies here while he's around? Even if he claims no interest in this war, he's still an enemy," Justin said, fixing his gaze on David. David met Justin's stare and replied, "Vasper benefits more from the Sylvan Concord winning this war, Justin. You know why." The Guardians fell into a tense silence, their gazes locked on one another. Jake, however, clenched his jaw, his frustration bubbling over. He despised the thought of Vasper being in the room with Chanty, a sharp thorn lodged in his throat. It infuriated him further that Chanty was bound to Vasper Mondragon by the king's decree of the Sylvan Concord. Meanwhile, inside the room, Chanty and Vasper sat in silence, their eyes doing all the talking. Vasper moved closer to Chanty, slowly reaching out to hold her hand. Chanty, however, pulled her hand away, not in the mood to entertain his gestures. Her rejection stung Vasper, who grew visibly restless. He gazed at her with pleading eyes, silently begging for a chance. "David, can I ask for just an hour's break?" Vasper's voice broke through the tension, his intention clear. He wanted to take Chanty somewhere private, where they could be alone. But Chanty shook her head firmly, her eyes locked on Vasper. "No," she mouthed silently, her refusal resolute. Vasper's gaze turned stern, his silent plea meeting Chanty's unwavering rejection. Outside, David and the Guardians exchanged tense glances. David, however, focused on Jake, his sympathy leaning toward him. "No, Vasper," David finally said. "Chanty needs proper rest. Let her be. Jake's teeth clenched tighter, his frustration mounting as he strained to hear what was happening in the room. The tension thickened when Chanty's whisper, though soft, reached everyone's ears. Vasper, please, not now, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Yet even that faint whisper ignited Jake's temper. Without hesitation, he teleported into Chanty's room. The guardians outside reacted instantly, their movements like lightning as they rushed to the room, arriving within moments. Left behind was Marco, standing outside with his hands on his hips, shaking his head as he stared at the now open door. Inside, the room was filled with the electric energy of their confrontation. The envoys, standing in an alert formation around the area, remained ready for any escalation. However, Marco signaled with his hand, a gesture indicating that everything was under control. Inside the tent, Vasper and Jake stood face to face, gripping each other's collars tightly. Their powerful and unyielding stares locked, their jaws clenched in fury. Their foreheads creased, and their eyes blazed with intensity. Veins bulged from their hands, necks, and temples, betraying their barely contained rage and the immense restraint they were exercising to avoid a full-blown fight in such a confined and sensitive space. Nearby, Chanty stood, tears streaming down her face as she watched the two men she cared about most at odds. Covering her mouth with her hand, she tried to stifle her sobs. She didn't want to scream or make a sound, fearing it would worsen the tension between the two powerful men who both loved her deeply. Chanty felt torn, unwilling to take sides, knowing that doing so could fuel their jealousy and escalate the chaos. David, leader of the Guardians, finally approached the two men. His voice was sharp and commanding. "Jake. Vasper. There's a proper time and place for your rage, even if you want to kill each other. But not now." David's clenched fists and gritted teeth betrayed his own frustration. If it were up to him, he would have knocked some sense into both of them right then and there. But Vasper and Jake seemed deaf to his words. "I want to finish him now, David," Jake spat, his voice dripping with fury. Vasper smirked, his expression mocking and taunting. "If you think you can, then do it, Jake," he said in a calm yet provocative tone, daring Jake to act. Chanty panicked at their heated exchange of words, fear and worry gripping her heart. She looked to David, who quickly gestured for Lewis to step in and help. Lewis hesitated but moved closer, only to be met with sharp glares from both Vasper and Jake. "Stay out of this, Lewis." Jake snapped, his voice laced with warning. Lewis froze, stunned by the intensity of the moment. David's anger flared even more as he turned to Jake. "Since when did you start disobeying me, Jake?" David's furious shout silenced everyone in the room. At that moment, Chanty climbed down from the bed and moved toward Jake and Vasper. Her voice cracked with frustration and exhaustion. "Both of you, can you please stop? I'm so tired of this, of the both of you. Just give me some peace." Her voice trembled as she looked at Vasper. "Vasper, go back to your kingdom." Then she turned to Jake, pleading, "And Jake, please. Enough." Her words hit both men like a thunderclap. Their gazes softened as they turned to Chanty, guilt and sympathy written all over their faces. For a brief moment, silence enveloped the room as both men realized how much their actions were hurting her. The 6 guardians stood by, observing intently, waiting to see what the two would do next. Slowly, almost in unison, Vasper and Jake released each other's collars and stepped away, putting distance between them. Yet, as if driven by the same instinct, they both moved closer to Chanty at the same time, wanting to comfort her. But before either of them could reach her, Chanty surprised everyone. She turned abruptly and walked straight to David, seeking solace from him instead. Everyone, including Vasper and Jake, stood frozen in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. "David, I just want to rest, please. I don't want anyone near me, not Vasper, not Jake," Chanty said through her tears. Her voice was trembling with exhaustion, and David, seeing her pain, immediately understood and felt a deep sympathy for her. The other guardians also shared the same empathy, while both Vasper and Jake felt the sting of Chanty's plea, their hearts heavy with guilt. David turned to the two men, his tone firm and commanding. "Did you hear her? Respect her request," he said before turning back to Chanty. Get some rest. You'll need your strength later, David added softly, his voice gentle yet reassuring. Facing Vasper and Jake once more, David's tone hardened. The two of you, leave now. Jake and Vasper hesitated, their reluctance clear in their expressions. But David stood his ground, patiently waiting. The other 5 guardians, sensing the tension, had already exited the room, with Jacob leading the way. David's gaze shifted to Jake, who lingered, his eyes fixed on Shanta's back. Chanty, however, had turned away, refusing to meet their eyes. She couldn't bear to see the emotions swirling in Vasper and Jake's gazes. With a sharp glare directed at Vasper, Jake suddenly vanished, teleporting away in silence. Vasper, still standing, looked at Chanty, his eyes full of sorrow and concern. Please. I'm sorry, Vasper whispered, his voice barely audible. But Chanty didn't turn to him, her silence a clear dismissal. Resigned, Vasper finally teleported away as well, leaving only David behind. Chanty, visibly drained, turned her weary gaze to David, her fatigue etched into her face. David looked at her with a serious yet understanding expression. Rest now. I'll leave, David said firmly. Chanty nodded weakly, her movements slow and subdued. Thank you, David, she replied softly. Without another word, David turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. Chanty was now alone. She moved to her bed and collapsed onto it, burying her face into the pillow. Silent tears began to flow as she tried to suppress the sobs that threatened to escape. She didn't want anyone outside to hear her pain. What Chanty didn't realize, however, was that Vasper had silently reappeared in the room. He stood at the foot of her bed, gazing at her as she cried, lying helplessly on the mattress. The guardians hadn't detected him, he had used his invisible shield to slip past unnoticed. Vasper's heart ached as he watched her. He wanted so badly to approach her, to hold her in his arms, to envelop her in the warmth of his embrace, and to kiss away her tears. He longed to soothe her with his presence, to silence her pain with his touch. But he held himself back, knowing that Chanty needed time to process her emotions. He understood that her feelings were conflicted, torn apart by the confrontation she had just endured with Jake Valerian. So, Vasper stood silently in the shadows, restraining his overwhelming desire to comfort her, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Meanwhile, outside Shanta's room, the guardians gathered at the round table, seated on the sofas in tense silence. Their sharp gazes were fixed on Jake, who returned their piercing stares with unwavering defiance. David leaned back against the sofa, exhaling a deep, weary sigh. I don't understand you anymore, Jake, David began in a low voice, audible only to the guardians. What they didn't realize was that Vasper, still hidden in Shanta's room, overheard every word. Can't you just behave yourself, Jake? You're not like the ordinary mortals, you're different. We have missions to fulfill, responsibilities to uphold. And with those missions come rules you've blatantly disregarded. All your training, wasted. And for what? For a single woman? My God, Jake. Is it right to throw away your duty as a guardian for just one woman? David's voice trembled with restrained anger, his veins bulging as he stared Jake down. Jake's expression remained stern, his gaze fixed on David with unyielding determination. The other guardians continued to watch him, particularly Jacob, their judgment evident in their eyes. I'm not happy with you, Jake, David continued, his tone heavier now. If it were up to me, I wouldn't have you in the guardians anymore. Jake let out a bitter chuckle, the sound laced with mockery and pain. Then do it, David. Please, just do it. That's what I want, Jake snapped back, his voice rising. But do I even have a choice? Do I? His shout echoed through the tent, silencing everyone inside, even the envoys who stood watch outside. The tension was palpable. The other guardians, lips pressed tightly shut, exchanged uneasy glances. Marco and Justin's expressions darkened in response to Jake's outburst, their loyalty to David unshakable. David's jaw clenched as he ground his teeth, his glare burning into Jake. But Jake didn't back down, he stared at David with equal intensity, prepared for whatever might come next. He was done playing by the rules of the inner world, done pretending to care about their power games. All he wanted was to be with Chanty. Was that so much to ask? Yet, the weight of his role as a guardian made even that simple desire feel unattainable. If I could, David, Jake continued, his voice breaking slightly, I would give up my powers right now just to be free from this duty I never wanted, never chose. I'm tired of it all. Tired of these endless battles, tired of serving kings who crave nothing but power. Jake's voice rose again, filled with raw frustration and despair. David abruptly stood, his body coiled with rage, ready to attack. But the 5 other guardians quickly stepped in, restraining him. Everyone in the tent was on high alert, their movements sharp and defensive. Meanwhile, in Chanty's room, both she and Vasper had risen to their feet, attuned to the escalating tension outside. They stood facing each other in silence, their eyes locking. Chanty couldn't stop Vasper from staying at her side. He had already wrapped his arms firmly around her waist, holding her close. Vasper's gaze was fixed on Chanty, his eyes soft with love yet fierce with a protective resolve. He silently vowed that no matter what, Jake would never get near her again. Chanty, however, felt a storm of worry brewing in her chest. As she listened to Jake and David argue, she could sense the depth of Jake's pain and frustration. She pitied him, understanding the torment he was experiencing. She wanted to go outside, but fear held her back. She knew Jake wasn't in the right frame of mind to face her, especially in his current state of denial about their situation. David's anger boiled over, but Jake remained seated, calm yet defiant. The 5 guardians stood behind David, a united front against Jake Valerian. The envoy soldiers outside the tent stood at attention, ready to act. Then, a deep rumble like rolling thunder reached their ears, growing louder with each passing moment. A powerful gust of wind swept through, threatening to tear apart the massive tent. Everyone froze, their attention snapping to the approaching force. The guardians recognized it instantly. A dragon was flying overhead. Chanty and Vasper, too, went on high alert. Vasper knew exactly who it was. His dragon, Dagon, had arrived. The chaos outside intensified as the guardians, Jake included, rushed out of the tent. But Jake's thoughts remained solely on Chanty. In an instant, he teleported back into her room, only to stop in his tracks, frozen by the sight before him. Vasper was holding Chanty close, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist. Jake's eyes met Chanty's, and in that moment, she could see the pain etched into his face, the anguish he could no longer hide. But there was also fury, barely contained, directed at Vasper. Chanty's heart raced, confusion and fear colliding within her. No words were exchanged between them, only the intense exchange of glances that spoke volumes. Lewis suddenly appeared in the room, his eyes darting to Vasper. "Zalora is outside, Vasper," Lewis informed him, his voice tense. Vasper's expression shifted, his calm demeanor giving way to urgency. Chanty, shocked by the mention of Zalora, stared at him with wide eyes, her breath hitching. Jake, still frozen in place, observed Chanty carefully, trying to read her reaction. Vasper met Chanty's gaze, silently pleading for her understanding. Outside, Zalora's voice rang out, commanding and impatient. "Bring Vasper and Chanty out, David." Chanty and Vasper looked at each other, their expressions conflicted. Jake, standing nearby, watched Chanty with concern etched deeply into his face. "My love," Jake suddenly spoke, his voice breaking, "this wouldn't happen to you if you were by my side. No other woman would dare interfere with us." Vasper shot Jake a sharp, warning glance. Lewis remained close to Jake, his posture alert, ready to intervene if necessary. Chanty's eyes welled with tears as she looked at Jake, her emotions tangled. "Please," Vasper said softly, his gaze locked on Chanty. "As I've told you before, don't let them affect you. I have no ties to her anymore, it's been a long time." Jake let out a low, mocking chuckle, but Vasper ignored him, his focus solely on Chanty, whom he was determined to protect. Suddenly, David entered the room, his presence commanding. His eyes quickly took in the scene, landing firmly on Vasper. Silence enveloped the room as everyone awaited the next move. "Enough of the drama here. Vasper, face Zalora," David commanded, his tone deadly serious as he fixed his sharp gaze on Vasper. Suddenly, Jake extended his hand toward Chanty. "My love, come here. You belong in my arms, not his," Jake declared, his voice firm and laced with longing. Chanty looked at Jake, her eyes filled with pity, while Vasper's piercing gaze shot daggers at Jake. David gestured toward Lewis, who moved closer to Jake. "Don't escalate the tension further, Jake," Lewis said, his tone calm but resolute. Jake, however, shot Lewis a sharp, challenging glare, his expression unyielding. From outside the tent, Zalora's voice erupted in a shout. "Don't make me come in there, Vasper," she bellowed, her tone heavy with anger and impatience. Vasper turned his attention to Chanty, his eyes pleading. "Please, let me handle her." "Stay here," he said softly, his voice soothing yet firm. He glanced at David briefly before focusing back on Chanty. Chanty remained silent, her wide, worried eyes reflecting the chaos surrounding her, Jake's relentless tension and the looming threat of Zalora. Without warning, Vasper pulled Chanty into a tight embrace. "Please stay with me. Trust me again," he whispered into her ear, his voice carrying both desperation and tenderness. Jake let out a sarcastic laugh, but Vasper ignored him completely. David and Lewis exchanged glances, disbelief etched on their faces at Jake's audacity to intensify the already volatile situation. Then, Vasper leaned down and kissed Chanty passionately on the lips. The sound of Jake's enraged voice shattered the moment as he spat the word, "bastard," with venomous precision. Chanty, flustered and overwhelmed, pushed against Vasper's chest. "Go, Vasper, please," she urged him, her voice trembling but resolute. She wanted him to confront Zalora, who was now practically bursting with anger outside the tent. Vasper hesitated, then kissed Chanty's hand tenderly before disappearing in a flash, teleporting outside the tent. David immediately moved toward Chanty, but Jake was faster. He reached Chanty first, pulling her tightly by the waist. Chanty gasped in shock, frozen in his grip, as David and Lewis looked on, equally stunned. Lewis reacted quickly, using his telekinesis to suspend Jake midair before he could teleport away with Chanty. David pried Jake's hand from Chanty's waist and pushed her behind him, ensuring she was safely out of Jake's reach. Jake stood motionless, his body frozen like a statue in the middle of the room. David led Chanty out of the room in haste, leaving Lewis and Jake behind. But to Lewis's surprise, Jake broke free from the telekinetic hold with a force that startled even him. Before Lewis could react, Jake grabbed him by the collar and lifted him effortlessly with one hand. Lewis was taken aback by Jake's growing strength, his body suspended in the air. Jake's deadly serious gaze bore into Lewis as he spoke in a low, menacing voice, his lips barely moving. "Who gave you the right, Lewis, to stop me from holding my wife?" Jake demanded, his tone icy and full of threat. Lewis could feel the weight of Jake's rage pressing down on him, but he remained composed. "Jake, we are not enemies. I don't want my fists to land on your face." "Don't provoke me," Lewis warned, his voice calm yet firm. Before the situation could escalate further, David stormed back into the room, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. He moved quickly to aid Lewis, but everyone was caught off guard when a piercing scream echoed from outside the tent. It was Zalora, and her voice carried a mix of fury and anguish as she called out for Chanty. "Lorenzo! Chanty!" Jake's attention snapped toward the sound, and with a sudden movement, he hurled Lewis against the bed with enough force to rattle the room. David rushed forward but was pushed onto Chanty's bed by Jake's raw strength. The wooden frame creaked and splintered as David and Lewis both collided with it. Despite the chaos, the two men recovered quickly, springing to their feet like lightning and racing after Jake as he stormed out of the tent. Outside, the scene was explosive. Jake had Chanty in his arms, holding her tightly as though he'd never let her go. Vasper stood facing Zalora, their gazes locked in an intense standoff. Chanty remained motionless, unable to move in Jake's iron embrace, her breath quick and shallow as she felt the tension crackling around them. Jake's fiery glare met Vasper's, a look that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of his soul. The unspoken challenge between them burned hot, the air thick with unyielding tension. Zalora stood poised, her sharp eyes scanning the area for threats, her body taut with alertness. Above her, Dagon, Vasper's dragon, hovered midair, restrained by nearly 100 glowing tridents wielded by the envoys. The dragon's power radiated through the battlefield, its roars shaking the very ground beneath them. But now, under Zalora's command, its ferocity had been redirected, its strength bound yet undeniable. The guardians formed a protective circle around Jake and Chanty, their stances rigid, their expressions wary. Meanwhile, the envoys surrounded Zalora and Vasper, creating an equally tense perimeter. Jake tightened his hold on Chanty, his defiant gaze never leaving Vasper's. The pain and fury simmering in Vasper's eyes clashed with Jake's steady, protective stance. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the air heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. The Council of Velantis decides who will be queen when you become king, Vasper, not you. Zalora shouted, her voice laced with defiance. I will never accept her as queen of Velantis while I am reduced to being just your mistress. Zalora spat, her tone biting as her anger twisted her beautiful features into something fierce and wounded. Chanty looked at Zalora, her wide eyes reflecting the silent storm within her. Fear hardened her heart, robbing her of the ability to cry, even as her chest tightened. Jake, standing apart, cast a disdainful gaze at both Zalora and Vasper, his expression dripping with contempt. Zalora, I never said you would be my mistress, nor do I plan on taking one. That tradition ends with me, Vasper said firmly, his tone steady. There will only be one queen in Velantis, and I will not follow the old ways of having mistresses, no matter what the kingdoms have done before. When I rule, that custom dies. Zalora's laugh rang out, loud and bitter, her beauty radiant and divine like a goddess, now tainted with the fierceness of a warrior. Her sword gleamed in her hand as she raised it with purpose. Suddenly, Zalora pointed the blade at Vasper's neck, and the gathered audience collectively gasped in shock. Chanty's eyes widened, glowing with alarm, as she stared at the scene before her. Zalora lifted her sword slightly, its edge grazing Vasper's throat. Vasper raised his head, unflinching, his expression calm despite the threat. He could have easily defended himself, but he allowed Zalora her moment, understanding the depth of her wounded pride and broken heart. Tears welled in Zalora's eyes as she looked at him, anguish and fury warring within her. But she wasn't the only one watching with pain in her heart. David, standing silently among the others, felt the sting of her sorrow as though it were his own. He had long harbored feelings for Zalora, but he knew her heart belonged entirely to Vasper Mondragon. Now, he bore witness to her suffering, helpless to ease her pain. You will not disgrace me here in the inner world, Vasper Mondragon, Zalora declared, her voice trembling with restrained rage. You will regret insulting my honor and breaking your promises to me. Even in death, I will never forget your betrayal. Her voice hardened as she pressed the tip of her blade against Vasper's skin, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled down his neck. Vasper remained unfazed, showing no sign of pain. Chanty, however, panicked, trying to rush forward, but Jake caught her wrist, holding her back firmly. Zalora and Vasper locked eyes, their gazes sharp and unyielding. I demand punishment, Vasper Mondragon. Zalora's voice rang out, cold and commanding. I want you to pay for your crimes against me. 7 days in the dragon's cave, wearing a suspended necklace, without food, chained, and bound. The words struck Chanty like lightning. A vision from the prophecy she'd seen in the Sword of Destiny flashed in her mind, Vasper, chained in a fiery cavern, his body weakened but his spirit unbroken. No! Chanty screamed, her voice wrought with emotion. The sound silenced everyone. All eyes turned to her, Zalora, Vasper, Jake, and the onlookers. Zalora's piercing gaze fixed on Chanty, while a cruel smirk curved her lips. Look at your queen, Vasper Mondragon, Zalora said, her tone mocking as she gestured toward Chanty, still held tightly in Jake's embrace. See how she's wrapped in her husband's arms. That's Jake, isn't it, Chanty? Her voice dripped with venom as her eyes bore into Chanty's. Vasper Mondragon, you intend to take her from her husband? Do you feel no guilt for their shared love? Zalora taunted, her words cutting like blades. Vasper's eyes flicked between Chanty and Jake, then settled back on Zalora. His voice was steady as he replied, you should return to Velantis and wait for the council meeting. Your concerns will be addressed diplomatically. We'll settle everything formally. Show the dignity of a princess of the inner world. Don't let your emotions rule you and risk losing the respect I still have for you." Zalora's anger flared even brighter, but her smile darkened into something chilling. "Speaking of respect, Vasper Mondragon, let me teach you a lesson," she said, her voice dripping with a sinister promise. She lowered her sword toward the space between Vasper's thighs, her movements deliberate and menacing. The onlookers, already shocked, now stared in stunned silence. "Teleport us both to the Dragon's Mountain," Zalora said, her voice suddenly soft and seductive, laden with a dangerous allure. Vasper understood her intent, his expression unreadable, while Chanty shivered, her body trembling as she looked away, unable to bear the tension. Jake noticed Chanty's reaction and turned her to face him, searching her eyes. Their gazes met, and Chanty's lips trembled as though she were about to cry. She silently prayed that Jake wouldn't see the turmoil in her heart. The guardians watched Jake and Chanty closely, observing every subtle movement. Vasper's eyes stayed locked on Chanty, his gaze intense, even as Zalora burned with rage at his diverted attention. Her presence was utterly ignored, leaving her feeling invisible and enraged. David, watching Zalora with quiet sorrow, was the only one who noticed Gabriel observing him. Gabriel saw the turmoil and longing in David's expression, understanding his silent struggle. In a fit of anger and jealousy, Zalora drove the tip of her sword into Vasper's thigh. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of his pants, staining them crimson. Vasper flinched slightly and turned to Zalora, his face impassive. Chanty, horrified, watched as blood trickled down Vasper's leg. Her heart clenched with worry, while Zalora seemed to revel in the sight of his pain. But for Vasper, the physical wound was nothing compared to the ache of jealousy twisting in his chest as he looked at Chanty and Jake's intense, unbroken eye contact. Zalora finally withdrew her sword and sheathed it at her side. She stepped closer to Vasper, her voice low and challenging. "Take me to the Dragon's Mountain, Vasper, and there I'll teach you what respect truly means," she said, her tone both mocking and commanding. Vasper looked at her, his lips curving into a sarcastic smile, while the onlookers held their breath, waiting to see what would unfold next. Chanty's jealousy burned hot in her chest, as fierce as the rapid pounding of her heart. Her gaze at Vasper, who smiled at Zalora, felt like a knife twisting in her gut, sharp and cutting. Her expression hardened, masking the pain that welled within her. Jake, standing nearby, was not immune to the scene either. He tasted the bitter sting of his own jealousy, knowing full well how affected Chanty was by Vasper's interaction with Zalora. The sight made his heart ache in ways he hadn't expected. David, who had been quietly observing everything, watched with a troubled expression. His inner turmoil deepened as he saw Zalora's longing gaze directed at Vasper, his feelings for her only intensifying in the face of the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, Vasper tilted his head back, letting out a deep, heavy sigh as he stared up at the sky. His silence weighed heavily on the gathering, and everyone's attention remained on him, especially Zalora. Her excitement was palpable. She could sense that soon, even if only briefly, she would have Vasper to herself once more. She remembered their old hideaway, the fire cave, where they had shared so many passionate and intimate moments together, a place steeped in desire and memories. As blood trickled down Vasper's neck from his earlier wound, it stirred something primal in Zalora. The sight of his blood was intoxicating, and it called her closer, pulling her toward him. She craved to taste it, to feel his warmth once again. The moment happened in a blur. As Vasper remained lost in thought, staring at the sky, so different from the blue of the outer world, Zalora acted. Her tongue, hot and swift, found his neck, lapping up the blood that flowed from his wound. Vasper's reaction was immediate. Startled, his eyes shot open, and he instinctively turned to see who had touched him. His gaze met Zalora's, their eyes locking in a tense exchange. Without a word, Vasper pushed Zalora away, his strong hand gripping her shoulder and forcing her to retreat. But even as Vasper distanced himself from Zalora, his eyes sought out Chanty. She had already turned away, unable to watch the interaction any longer. Her back was to them now, as though she could erase what she had seen by looking elsewhere. Vasper, still silent, glanced at Jake, who stood with a sardonic smile on his face. The tension between them thickened, but neither man spoke. David, too, remained watchful, his expression tight and unreadable as he witnessed the events unfold. The onlookers were stunned by what they had just seen, unsure how to process the sudden shift in the air. Zalora, however, didn't seem fazed. Her beauty only intensified as she smiled sweetly at Vasper, her expression soft yet filled with unspoken longing. Suddenly, Vasper grew serious. His face hardened, and without warning, he vanished from their sight. The crowd murmured in confusion, craning their necks to see where he had gone. Zalora's smile faltered, her expression changing as she scanned the area. When her eyes landed on where Chanty had been standing, she realized that Chanty had disappeared too. The only one left was Jake, his face twisted with fury. Everyone grew alert, especially David. A tense silence fell over the gathering. Zalora didn't speak, but she moved slowly toward her dragon, Dagon, who was closely watched by the envoys. The surrounding eyes followed her every step, taking in her proud yet despairing posture. David longed to approach her, to offer comfort, but he held himself back, forcing himself to stay where he was. His emotions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. In his rage, Jake, too, vanished without a word, teleporting away from the scene. The silence that followed was broken only by David's loud, frustrated sigh as he struggled to keep his own emotions in check. Zalora, her stance strong and resolute, climbed atop Dagon's massive back. The envoys released their hold on the dragon, stepping away as the creature spread its mighty wings, its power radiating through the air. Dagon, the most feared dragon in the inner world, the dragon of Vasper Mondragon, was a force to be reckoned with. As Dagon lifted off, the ground trembled beneath them. The onlookers braced themselves, holding their positions against the powerful gusts of wind that whipped through the air with the dragon's ascent. Their gazes followed Dagon as he flew higher and higher, until he disappeared from sight entirely, leaving nothing but the swirling dust in his wake. David glanced at his watch, realizing that less than 10 hours remained until twilight, the moment they had all been waiting for. With Dagon gone, everyone returned to the tents, the weight of the day pressing heavily on them. In his frustration, David kicked the leg of a nearby table, his strength splitting the wood clean in two. The table collapsed with a sharp crack, and the surrounding envoys hurried to clean up the mess, while the guardians exchanged dark, intense glances, their faces grim. Jacob, standing off to the side, let the fire flicker and dance in his hands. Blue flames curled around his fingers, licking at the air as if alive. His expression was dark, consumed with the intensity of his power and his feelings. Justin, watching him closely, understood what Jacob was feeling. He could sense the tension, the barely controlled anger within him. "I can't wait for the day Jake will be forced to intervene," thinking about Vasper, Jacob growled, his voice low and seething with fury. "I'll crush his skull," he added through gritted teeth, his fingers clenching as the blue flames flared even brighter.